Welcome to Hence the Future podcast. I'm Justin Clark,
I'm Mattimore Cronin.
and today we're discussing the future of warfare. So, we'll discuss all different types of warfare. We'll get into cyber war, space war, nuclear war, information war. We'll talk about autonomous weapons, a little bit of game theory, among some other topics. But first, let's start with you, Mattimore, and maybe explain the concept of the gray zone.
Yeah, so I love this concept of the gray zone because it really encapsulates the current state that we're in when it comes to war. So, the former state of affairs was that there was mutually assured destruction, right? So we had nuclear bombs, other countries had nuclear bombs, and then there were all these books written about the end of history, and people thought that it was just going to sort of be this nice utopia world because we all realized we can destroy each other. However, what ended up happening is people realized there's a lot of wiggle room in the middle because you're not going to spark a nuclear conflict over just anything. So
Right.
to put a real definition to it, the gray zone is a state of affairs where nations use intimidation and coercion in the space between war and peace. And, you can see this right now. Every single day, there are hackers that hack into the U.S. government.
Or at
And
least attempt to.
right. I think I saw a number that there's over 1 billion infiltrations in national security systems in the past year. Not ours, but like globally. So,
Wow.
and the year before that, it was like 250 million. So just the rate at which we're passing the line that many would consider to
Yeah.
be like an act of war, it's just happening many, many times per day.
Right.
So that's on the side. That's on like the cyber front, and then the information front is also happening every day. I mean, you can see that with, Russia hacking America's elections, or recently there was even Iran tried to hack into Trump's email through Microsoft because Iran doesn't like what Trump has been doing.
Okay.
And there's just so many examples of, or you can look at Syria as another example, but there are so many conflicts that are happening between this area of peace and war that defines the gray zone. So when
Right.
we look towards what is going to happen in the future, part of the big question is what are the specific types of acts that could trigger something greater, like something beyond? Like, what would it take for the current state to escalate to a state where there's actual, war between great superpowers? That's an open question, but if you have any credence in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, who put out the doomsday clock reading every year, according to them, we are 2 minutes to midnight, which is the closest we've been since 1953, shortly
Wow.
after World War II, when the Cold War was really at its height, at its scariest moments.
So do you agree with that? Because like my own personal opinion is there's so much to lose and there's so many nuclear weapons out there. Like I would be very surprised if anything were to happen between superpowers. I think the only thing that I could see where nuclear bombs are used in war again is if some ideological group, let's say ISIS, gets a hold of them, where the likely outcome, which is mutually assured destruction, is welcomed, right? Like the ISIS doesn't care if they destroy themselves as long as they destroy everything else. So that's the only type of organization that I could see, using nuclear bombs and being happy with the outcome.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think the likelihood of a true nation state saying we're going to nuke you and then they nuke you is just so unlikely. But I mean, part of what defines the gray zone is you can do all of these things without it being obvious that you're the one that's doing it. So, for
Uh-huh.
instance, like, Iran bombed the Saudi oil field. It's still not 100% clear that it was Iran, and it was just some small drone that infiltrated this like multi-billion-dollar defense system.
Mhm.
And, that was something that was, or another example is, in Crimea, Russia put their quote unquote little green men to invade the Crimean Peninsula, and they didn't have Russian badges, so they had plausible deniability. And so whenever any nations get angry, they can just say, "Oh, it wasn't really us." And that's sort
Yeah.
of what happens with cyber, because it's really easy to sort of cover your footprints with cyber compared to
Yeah,
other
like
domains.
VPNs or anything else. Yeah,
Yeah,
it seems like there's really a rise in just obfuscation of your tactics. If you're fighting against someone else and you can kind of, hide who the perpetrator is. You can hide that you're orchestrating things. So that you could, in physical warfare, maybe you hire mercenaries. And
right. And
in
that's
cyber warfare, you use VPNs and a whole bunch of proxies and stuff. So it's hard to trace back where, this attack originated from.
exactly. And the use of mercenaries has been rising dramatically. If you look at there's some really great charts that show the number of conflicts that are state versus state versus a regional conflict that's backed by big states and powers versus like a pure regional conflict. And there's just far more proxy battles where it's like we're not directly fighting against Russia, we're not directly fighting against China, but we're doing all of these proxy battles in places like Syria and Yemen, and many of them are with mercenary soldiers that aren't, by definition, American soldiers. I mean, usually it's not as much. I
Right.
mean, America does this too, but it's all countries that have been, following this trend.
Yeah, I
And
was actually curious like, I thought mercenaries were just this thing of movies, right? That countries would hire mercenaries or
right,
big
right.
rich corporations would hire mercenaries to do their bidding. But I didn't realize like the U.S. they never signed. I forgot exactly what the treaty was, but the U.S., the U.K., like some really major countries are still allowed to use mercenaries, and I thought it was illegal and not even something that happened
Oh,
before
totally.
researching for this.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these guys are ex special forces, and
Yeah,
they
and
just get
that's
hired
scary.
to do these covert ops. And then, if something bad happens, it's not like, America did an act of war. It's more like, oh, some
Hmm.
mercenaries did something, and it's far less of a big deal.
Yeah,
Um,
and if you have a team of mercenaries that are, let's say, Australian special forces, English special forces, and you just have this diverse group, then you really have a hard time telling who the perpetrator is. Now, if you have a whole bunch of like US ex-Navy SEALs that are in, some mercenary group, then maybe it's a little bit easier to figure out who sent these soldiers, but
mhm.
I don't
Well, and
know.
and even if it's super clear, like, okay, these are obvious. This is obviously an American act because they're all former Navy SEALs. We're still living in this new era where you can pretty much deny anything, and there's
Yeah.
no shared set of facts that everyone has. And especially when you think about like what's the difference between, the state of affairs in the US as opposed to China. So much of it's about the flow of information and controlling the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So, with the Hong Kong protests, which we had an episode dedicated to
Mm-hmm.
that, it was very clear that China is essentially blaming a lot of these protests on Western antagonism, and basically like the West is egging on these protesters, which there's absolutely no evidence of that. In fact, the
Mm-hmm.
Trump administration has done all they can to stay out of it, as have American corporations. But
Yeah.
that's what the story is. If you're
Yeah.
in mainland China, that's what
Mm-hmm.
you think is the truth. And this brings up really the greatest question in my mind in this whole Future of War episode, which is war between the US and China inevitable? Because as you look at all the different players, of course there's Russia and Iran and, all these other players, but it's really like comes down to two sort of models for civilization. One is more of an authoritarian model that controls information, and the other is, what has been the sort of democratic capitalist model that we have and that the West has.
Mm-hmm.
And it's worth noting that we're in a state of affairs where almost inevitably China will surpass the US. The economy has already surpassed the US, and
Mm-hmm.
fairly soon they'll surpass the US in almost all dimensions. So, and then when you look at history, there have been 16 times in recorded history where a rising power has overtaken a ruling power. 12 of
Yeah.
those 16 times, war ensued between those two powers. So the odds
Wow.
are in favor of there being a conflict. And I don't know
Yeah.
if you've heard about, President Xi's sort of long-term plan for China, but essentially by 2025, China plans to be the leader in 10 high-tech industries,
Yeah. Yeah.
including
Yeah.
robotics, AI, quantum computing, nuclear, and others.
Okay.
By
Yep.
2035, China plans to be the global leader in all advanced technologies. So like maybe we still have like the best Netflix content, but China's like leading in all the stuff that really matters for the future of
Yeah.
civilization. And then by 2049, which is the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, China plans to be simply number one in all categories, which includes an unchallenged army, military force. And that's the 100-year anniversary, and that's 30 years from now. I'll be 58 at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Just to put in context, 30 years ago, the World Wide Web hadn't even been invented. So a lot can change in 30 years. And when you think about the likelihood of China achieving those goals, they've pretty much hit all of the milestones that they've set for themselves. And I saw this one video that just compared how efficient China is compared to the US with its infrastructure. And they
Mm-hmm.
showed this one bridge that was built in Boston that took 4 years to build, because it's all, just typical
Yeah.
bureaucratic American,
Mm-hmm.
like helping your brother-in-law, they get paid by the hour, like,
Yeah.
typical American business government stuff.
Yep.
In China, a similar bridge took 43 hours to build. So 43 hours versus 4 years to build a bridge. And it's
Wow.
just the level of efficiency is so much greater in China because they just straight up control like pretty much everything that happens in their country.
Yep.
So if you're trying to consider the likelihood of China meeting its future goals of surpassing us in first the top 10 areas of technology, then all areas of technology, then everything, including military, it seems closer to the likely scenario than not, and at least in my view.
Yeah. So I have one piece of hope
Okay.
regarding the China growth. And I think that China is definitely good at executing things where there is a plan and there is a known set of, like, there's a known recipe to do this thing, like build a bridge, like build a city. What I don't think China will necessarily beat the US at, and what I think the US is just like inherently superior at, is, and just like
Innovation.
Western culture, yes, innovation, because we're not being censored all the time, and it's much easier for scientists and people in the United States to understand how the world really works because we're not just being fed propaganda about,
Right.
all
But I
of
have
this.
a counterexample.
Okay,
So,
okay.
how much of an advantage is it if you're spending all these billions of dollars innovating, if immediately once you create something worthwhile, it gets copied by China? For instance, this happened just recently with Lockheed Martin's F-35 fighter jet, which is the most
Mm,
advanced and expensive fighter jet to date.
okay.
Within like months after this came out, China had hacked into Lockheed Martin's system and essentially stolen the designs and created a very similar plane in China that's way cheaper to build.
Oh,
And
okay.
so
That
it's
is a
like,
good counterexample because if it, then that strikes the type of war we were talking about at the beginning, which is information warfare, cyber, or not really information, but cyber warfare, where it's,
Hmm.
they're trying to hack in. And I mean, really what it boils down to is what is the resource that they're going for? And in this cyber warfare, they're just fighting for information, like the
Hmm.
information we have. And if they're getting the information successfully, and that's pretty much all they need, I suppose. If they have the plans and they don't even need to go through the whole innovation process. You know,
Right,
I,
right.
I, I think you changed my mind just now. That's
Yeah, man. I wish I thought there was more of an advantage to our innovative
yeah.
nature, and maybe we
Unless we just
will.
had better security, like that's
Right.
the only thing.
Well, I did hear about there's these new security systems that are basically like a fake system that once infiltrated, the enemy thinks they've infiltrated your actual system, but instead you've sort of set up
Uh,
this like prop. So, for instance, typical hack, one way to get in is you just dump a bunch of USB drives in front of the Pentagon or whatever, which actually allowed China to infiltrate our. Or no, this was actually sorry, this was a Russia infiltration that happened. New York Times reported,
mhm.
and that's one way to get in. And then once they're in, they can basically see like CEO level access of everything that's going on within that system.
Mhm.
But one way to counter that is you have a front. So they think they're seeing all the emails back and forth, but what they're really seeing is this like fake setup that we've put in there, and that allows us to essentially spy back at them. And we can even
Yeah.
feed them like the wrong information and that kind of thing. So there are some countermeasures with cybersecurity, and the US has gotten much better with cybersecurity. This is actually one of the things that I like that President Trump has done is issued an executive order to have more capabilities of cyber command in the U.S. He also established the Space Force. I think both of those things are
Hmm.
necessary given the current state of affairs.
Hmm.
But part of what, at least through my research, I found is that with cyber war, it's pretty much a standoff, meaning we know we can shut down Russia's power grid. We also know Russia can shut down our power grid. Therefore, we're not going to do it to them because they could just do it to us. And this tends to be the state of affairs with all major powers that have lots of cyber capabilities.
Hmm.
So the cyber war is just something that's constant, and it's sort of like something we always know we could go to that level, but we
Yeah.
don't want to unless we really have to, because especially because the US has a different moral standards. We know if we shut off the power grid in Russia, many
Hmm.
elderly people in hospitals will die, and then that doesn't
Right.
look good for us.
Right. So back to your question about a war breaking out between U.S. and China, couldn't it be argued that one already has broken out? There is sort of this gray area
Right, well
of
that's
cyber
the
war
yeah.
between us going on. Do you think it will escalate in our lifetimes to a physical war? Or will it remain cyber, even if it's more like targeted and, catastrophic cyber attacks
Right.
like the shutting down power grids and stuff?
So
Or
so
what do
if
you think?
you mean if by physical you mean American troops fighting Chinese troops head to head, I would say that's somewhat unlikely. But if it means, you know, American forces using drones to take out key infrastructure and, China using cyber, like there are so many other ways that war could happen.
Hmm.
Um, and one thing that's interesting when you look throughout history is that, with these 12 of the 16 cases where war has ensued between the rising power and the ruling power, most of the time it's through a third party that actually sparks the conflict. So, Franz Ferdinand getting shot was, famously how the First World War got started. Similarly, you could imagine, for instance, China invading Taiwan or annexing
Hmm.
Tibet, or North Korea invading South Korea or bombing Seoul.
Right.
Or another interesting place is there's this thing called the Solwaki Gap, You could actually see it in your map behind if you look at like where Russia is and then where
Uh-huh.
Poland is and your map. But
Okay.
essentially, there's this small land in between Poland and the Baltic nations, like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And if Russia basically invaded this little small land area, they could essentially annex all of those Baltic nations that used to be part of the Soviet Union. And there's very little we could do about that.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
if you think the trend of Russia annexing Crimea would continue, which by all appearances it seems like it will, then that would be an obvious next step for them. Now,
Mhm.
another area where it could happen is in the South China Sea. You know, China famously has this 9 dash line where they basically say, oh, yeah, we own this whole sea, which is not something that's internationally recognized, but they've basically been arming up these islands, and all of Southeast Asia is like freaked out. Like they like the cheap technology and infrastructure and investments from China, but they're a little freaked out by, so that's another area is what if China just basically said, okay, we own all of Southeast Asia now? And another area that could be the area of conflict is the Arctic. So, as we know
Right.
from our climate episodes, the Arctic is melting, the ice sheets are receding, and therefore there is going to be a new passageway through the north, which is huge for trade.
Yep.
And
Because
it's,
it's the shortest travel. Like that cuts travel times way down. If you're shipping from like the middle of Russia to Canada or some, to the US or something, the route for that is ridiculously short.
exactly. And there's lots of resources there. So, these
Hmm.
are all areas where conflict could erupt, and it's likely not going to be that China does something directly at the US or vice versa. It's likely going to be some third party, and then the US has to decide how should we respond? How do we respond? And then how that would escalate determines civilization. Like what's going to happen to all of us, basically.
Oh
Um,
man. Yeah, so what do you think are some of these resources that will be fought over of the future? You kind of mentioned the
yeah,
passageway of the North, but there's also, space, and we kind of need, let's
right.
I think it'd be interesting to talk about space a little bit. Who owns the moon? Because there's a space treaty, we're supposedly not going to fight over the moon because we saw what colonization did to Earthlings, but do you think that'll hold? Like, it seems likely that there might be some sort of war for resources on the moon, given how important some land would be there for space launches because of
Yeah.
the low gravity situation.
Yeah, I think that is going to be a big area of conflict. However, I don't think that's going to happen in the short or medium term. Because
Hmm.
I think if
Okay.
any nations just invest so much in trying to take over the moon or defend the moon, the opportunity cost of them not dealing with the territory on Earth is going to be
Hmm.
too great, at least in the 21st century, is my basic
Yeah.
prediction. But on Earth, there are going to be fights over resources. You could argue that the situation in Syria is a result of climate change because there was a massive drought in Syria
Mm.
which sparked all of this like uprising and little
Yeah.
wars. And now look at what's going on. I mean, we have all of these different nations doing proxy battles there. It's very
Hmm.
unclear. We just pulled out. The Kurds are getting bombed. There's ISIS is potentially reemerging. It's like there's so much bad stuff happening there, and it's
Hmm.
just like the tip of the iceberg of climate change, like how climate change is going to strain
Oh
resources going
yeah.
forward.
What happens
India,
when it wipes out some of the biggest cities? Like, let's say sea levels rise a little bit, and people have to flee to the center parts of countries.
yeah. So for
That's
instance,
going to be a huge population flow to the middle.
right. So we've talked about how Malaysia is going to be completely underwater by
Mm.
the end of the century. Lots of Southeast Asia is at risk. That may result in China just saying, "Hey, we'll save you guys, but we own you now." like, you
Oh
know,
God.
um,
Yeah.
and yeah, I mean, climate change is a very serious driver of conflict in the future. also between India and Pakistan, two nuclear armed nations.
Mm-hmm.
And they are right now fighting over an area, Kashmir, which
Mm-hmm.
has a lot of the mountains that collect water, and then that water melts on the ice, and it provides a lot of the fresh water for both India and Pakistan. So you could see them fighting over that. And I was talking to Kip about this, and he was saying that even if like there was a local nuclear battle between India and Pakistan that didn't go to other countries, like it's not a world war, it's just a local war, even
Mm-hmm.
that could spark a runaway climate change event where the earth is now warming a lot faster than previously, and then that creates even more conflicts over
Mm-hmm.
resources. You know, the Middle
Yeah.
East is already a place that's very dangerous. Lots of wars are happening there. But if you look at the projections of climate change, you're not going to be able to even live there in the summer because the heats will be
Mm-hmm.
beyond a level that the human body is able to regulate its
Mm-hmm.
own temperature.
Oh,
So it's
yeah.
yeah, it's
I mean, that freshwater resources, land, I don't know how important fresh water will be. It's, if technology progresses enough, hopefully we can
yeah.
have cheap
Desalination is the
desalination.
big,
Yeah.
but
If
like
desalination doesn't happen,
right. But
that's
even
an
if it
issue.
happens, and it will, because Israel's already doing it,
Hmm.
it's still going to be something that only wealthy countries can afford, and only wealthy
True.
people
Yeah.
within poor countries can afford.
And
So,
what happens when you're landlocked? If you're in the middle of a country and you don't really have that many natural water resources, do you have to do you have to import fresh water from countries that are on the coast if there are no water resources? And if that's the case,
right.
what's the relationship between this country that doesn't have water resources and the other? Because it's totally dependent. Then that kind of gets into the whole game theory thing. Like how do you position yourself as a country going forward in the context of all of the things that are changing?
Yeah. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of desperate people on both
Hmm.
sides. And yeah, I find the game theory particularly interesting in space, which we touched on a little bit. Because,
Okay.
so when you think about how the United States operates its military globally, it's all dependent on satellites. There's very little we could do without satellites. And when you just
Hmm.
think of where we are in the US on the globe and where we're having these troops, like for instance in Syria, we need a satellite to be able to reach those troops. But oftentimes, if it's that far away from the US, we would actually need to ping two different satellites to reach them.
Oh, okay.
But that creates a time lag, which is a serious disadvantage when you're in like moment to moment combat
Hmm.
situations. So
Yep.
what's even more important is that we have bases all over the globe that allow us to communicate with just one satellite so we can very quickly take control of our forces wherever they are in the world.
Hmm.
And the US has over 800 military bases around the world. In almost more than half of the countries in the world, there's a US military base. And a lot of people don't
Wow.
realize this, but we never pull out of countries once we quote unquote win the war. We just stay there. We still have a major base in Germany. We have
Hmm.
major bases in Japan. Like everywhere we go, we just keep a base there because we realize that we're in this sort of infinite game. It's not like
Hmm.
you can ever really win a war. And so the question arises of what if our satellite capabilities got taken out? And that's been an increasing worry among military officials because
Hmm.
it's fairly easy to take out satellites because remember, even if you like flipped a penny in outer space, it's gonna like have so much momentum and inertia that it'll just go straight through steel.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even if you just keep a penny, if you were to just drop a penny without moving, obviously you would have to not be orbiting. There are complexities to
Right.
this. But the orbit, the how fast these satellites are moving are like thousands of miles an
Mm-hmm.
hour. If that just
Yeah,
hits a penny, the penny will just seemingly shoot straight through it, even though the satellite was the thing that's going super fast. So you could
exactly.
just throw debris up there and like, oops, accidentally destroyed a satellite. And
Yeah. Well, that is the biggest deterring factor for why people don't do that, is that it
mhm,
creates all this space junk.
yeah,
So if you're China and you shoot some bullets at a US satellite, the satellite's going to get destroyed pretty easily. But then you have these bullets orbiting around thousands of miles an hour. They're going to hit your satellites. So that whole orbit is going to be pretty useless. Now, they are looking into lasers because lasers have the benefit of being environmentally friendly, meaning you can essentially incinerate something and then there's just heat release. There's no like, there's no junk or empty bullet
yeah,
cases and that kind of thing. The problem with lasers is that it only makes sense to shoot them over short distances because it requires so much energy that you
yeah,
can't really shoot them long distances.
yeah,
So when we talk about like what would space battle be like, it's likely going to be very long range battles. Like you're not going to have spaceships right next to each other because you
yeah.
can sense other
It's
ships
not going to
on
be like
radar.
Star Wars.
It's not going to be like Star Wars at all. It's mostly going to be ships very far away from each other that can track each other from very far away that then shoot these self-guiding missiles at each other, and then maybe they have laser defense systems so that when something comes up close they can zap those missiles away
Mm,
before they hit their own defenses.
okay.
But even in that case, the ships are going to be very, very lightly armored because you just can't travel fast in space if you're heavy at all. So it's going to be
Right.
very easy to take out spaceships if you do hit them with anything.
Yeah. So do you think that that will happen before us on Earth get our shit figured out? If we are there really going to be space battles before we can, resolve the conflict with us in China, for example,
Yeah.
or anything else?
Well, Quartz put together this fantastic document on the future of war, and they interviewed all of these generals, and this just came out like a week ago, so it's
Hmm.
very up to date. And a lot of U.S. generals are very concerned right now about a quote unquote space Pearl Harbor, meaning, what if all of a sudden all of our capabilities just black out because our satellites have been destroyed and we're pretty defenseless? That could happen already, like today. We already know that there are satellites that have been launched by China and other countries that are really just
Hmm.
disguised as satellites, and we perceive them more as weapons in space. There is that deterring factor that we talked about you don't want to create too much space junk, but it is a move on the chessboard that's possible.
Yeah. I wonder what the countermeasures to that are. If there are, I would be surprised if the US didn't have like non-satellite based countermeasures to this.
We do.
Um,
The problem is that all of our missile defense systems to protect us from nuclear bombs are dependent on satellites. So
okay.
let's say for instance, there's a scenario where all of a sudden we realize China is about to invade Taiwan and just take
Hmm.
them over. And Taiwan calls the US and they're like, we need your help. So America launches, ships and fighter jets and whatever to basically try to pressure China to stand down. And then in response, China shoots down one of our satellites that makes us not operational in that area. Now, two things could happen. One
Hmm.
is we think, okay, this is just a typical gray zone area aggression. They're not really trying to destroy us.
Hmm.
We'll let them take Taiwan because we don't want to go into nuclear war. Or if we had more of a hawk in the White House, it could be perceived as China has taken out our ability to defend ourselves against a nuclear strike by taking out our satellite. Therefore, this is the beginning of World War III. We got to
Yeah.
nuke them right now because if you think they're going to nuke you, you only have a very small amount of time to respond.
Yeah. What is it, like 30 minutes?
Yeah, and the other So now we're getting a little bit into nuclear. I want to talk about that.
Mhm.
One of the interesting advancements with nuclear technology are these quote unquote supersonic missiles. Now, we've had supersonic missiles for a while, but the difference is that these new supersonic missiles go, more than 10x the speed of sound. So not just a little more than the speed of
Wow.
sound, like way faster than the speed of sound.
Yep.
And they have gliders, so they're able to like twirl around, and they don't move in the typical predictable path, because almost all of our missile defense systems are based on, oh, we see an incoming missile, beep, 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 it's getting closer, it's going in this straight linear path, and then we intercept it. But if you have a program that has some randomization built into it, where it just, where it's going to end up, but how it gets there is somewhat randomized, and it's sort of like
Right.
gliding and swirling around and twisting, and it's also going more than 10x the speed of sound, then
Right.
it becomes, again, almost impossible to defend yourself against them. And these already exist today.
Hmm. I wonder if at some point in the future, well, because obviously weapons themselves are advancing pretty, you know, pretty steadily. But what about defense? It seems
Hmm.
like you were talking about lasers. It seems like that kind of technology could potentially be used for defense as well, not just for
Yeah.
attacking. And you're kind of saying how you could use it as, a missile defense system, as in like the missile itself is, or a rocket itself is defending itself against, um, other spaceships trying to shoot it down. So
Right.
you could probably use that on a bigger scale to shoot down entire missiles, if they
Yeah.
were strong enough.
The difficulty is that it's a lot harder to defend a whole country than to
Hmm.
defend a spaceship, just because the amount of area. Like, I'm sure we could implement something that protected DC for sure, but to protect every city in the US, and not just against, like, one missile going to each of those cities, but potentially thousands of missiles going to every city, just the
Yeah.
level of the number of ballistic missiles, from a country like China is staggering. We know that China has the greatest ballistic missile capability on the planet, greater than the U.S.
Wow.
Just as from by the numbers.
Yeah. So maybe what could happen is some sort of sensor network. So we could, and obviously we would need a very sophisticated, maybe this is a very good narrow AI or very good
Yeah.
computer program with a bunch of sensors that could sort of get the lay of the land. Like, where are all the missiles? Where does everything need to go? If
Right.
the defense weapons, or the defense machines themselves are cheap enough to make, we can at least put them in a bunch of places and coordinate and have one centralized program, coordinate their defense because they
Yeah.
know where everything is, which would be pretty cool. But again, that's not in our capacity right now
Yeah.
by any means.
Well, that's interesting you brought that up, because one of the solutions that's been proposed for the whole space issue is, okay, so if it's so easy to take out these satellites, why not just have like thousands of satellites that are like little mini swarm drone kind of guys, so that even if you
Hmm.
destroy one of them, it's like not a big deal because we have so many of them, they're almost disposable.
Hmm.
So you could do something similar with having a lot of like little sensors around, and AI is going to be a huge part of which country is
Hmm.
dominant militarily, because it's all just, there's so many potential things you would want to sense, and so many
Yeah.
potential machines and military bases and personnel you'd want to control or command,
Hmm.
that it really is like an information processing and control problem.
Yeah.
It is a little worrisome that AI is at the top of that list of the 10 areas that China plans to dominate in by 2025,
Mm.
which is, almost just over 5 years away.
Yeah. Are there any types of weaponry that don't really exist right now? Um, that are terrifying to you? Like, for example, one that terrifies me after watching Black Mirror are these little baby drones, like a
Right.
little insect that can go in and, have a bunch of pressure go towards your
Yeah.
brain, and then you're dead. And that's it. Like, where did that thing come from? It just looks like a bug. It can sneak up on anybody, including the president. Like,
Right, right.
that's
Yeah, that
pretty
does scare me.
terrifying.
And that I would put that under the category of autonomous weapons.
Hmm.
And this is very terrifying, this whole area. It's worth noting that we already have autonomous weapons. So we already have sentry weapons, which anyone who's played Call of Duty is aware of, which is basically you put a sentry in front of like the entrance of a base, and it'll just
Hmm.
shoot anyone that comes through that's not a friendly.
Yeah.
There's also um, air defense systems, which we talked about, which basically they identify incoming missiles and then they shoot them down without need human intervention because
Yep.
humans wouldn't be quick enough to respond anyways.
Yep.
And we also have long range self guiding missiles, which a real person has to fire it, but it does the job of actually getting there.
Yeah.
And then the other thing we have are, we have autonomous drones, of course, and we also have loitering munitions, which these are interesting because basically it's like you have this drone that's just like hovering over an area. Like, let's say there's like a secret meeting of between like ISIS leaders. You just put one of these guys there and you just program it that if any people that match this facial recognition list come out of there, fire. So you like
Oh man.
pre-program it what to do, but it carries it out autonomously based on what it recognizes in that situation.
Oh,
And we're getting very close to this like fully autonomous area, and I find it interesting to look at what's like the current state of consumer technology, like, and there are these drones where it'll literally just automatically follow you around everywhere, and they have this new capability where you basically just push the joystick forward and it'll automatically like avoid any sort of barriers. Like they showed this video of it like just swerving in between the trees and everything, and no matter how
yeah.
you move your joystick, it will not hit a barrier. And so when you think
Dude.
about like what is the future of autonomous weapons, either it's fully autonomous and there's just no qualms about letting machines make any life or death decision that they would need
Hmm.
to, or there's some uh, you know there's some human input that's needed, but it's very just I don't know what the right word is for it. It's like very much just a matter of course rather than it being meaningful input. Like you could imagine
Yeah.
a situation where there's some guy sitting in Oklahoma that, in some bunker that just like something lights up and he presses a button and it lights up and he presses a button and just like every time he's just like,
Yeah.
he's basically checking the box of yes, we do abide by the autonomous weapons treaty, which doesn't even exist, by the way. It would be fantastic if there were such a treaty.
Mhm. Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's not a matter of is it technologically feasible to create autonomous weapons? It's a moral question of are we willing to, as globally, and what happens if, most of us aren't willing to do it, but then some rogue, terror groups or rogue nations do
Hmm.
implement them. It's a really
Yeah.
scary area.
Yeah, and you also have to think of the appeal of these sort of weapons too, right? It's not just like these things are complete evil to everybody, because sometimes if yeah, it saves your own lives. It say, if you're an American, it would be, if you're an American soldier, it would be nice if there was a robot going in for you instead of you.
Yeah.
So it's, no one's going to die except for the enemies, and that's appealing to people.
That's the other thing is even for the targets, at least, because these systems are more accurate than human beings, they're going to have less collateral damage, less civilian deaths.
Mhm. Yeah, and they can be way more targeted, way just super precise. Obviously, this is not me like agreeing with a lot of the aerial, the drones and the bombings that are going on, because there are definitely civilian casualties, but at the same time, it's still a human pulling the trigger. It's not that targeted. It's still more targeted than, a napalm strike or, some of these archaic bombing methods that we used to use, but it's still bad that
Hmm.
there's a lot of these civilian casualties. And maybe that's also just the nature of the war that we're fighting in the Middle East as well, because it's more of a guerrilla warfare where the insurgents are living among the general populace.
Right, right.
And that makes it way more likely that there are civilian casualties. And that's what's so hard about this war in particular.
Yeah. And this also gets into the game theory aspect of it because
Mhm.
there's this interesting distinction between finite wars and infinite wars where there used to be finite wars where once you defeat the opposing army, you own that territory and it's
Mhm.
done. You own it now. But
Yeah.
what we've seen, since Vietnam and beyond is that, America thought we were going to go into Vietnam and it was going to be an easy victory. Same thing when we went into Iraq.
Mhm.
But there are no easy victories anymore because when you're fighting against, guerrilla insurgents that are fighting for their lives and for their way of life, they're not going to give up until they're all dead and until the ideals that they abide by that drive them are also wiped out, which is pretty almost impossible to do.
Mhm.
So what we find ourselves now is in this new paradigm of infinite wars. And Simon Sinek has this fantastic TED Talk where he talks about this new paradigm. And he says that the big mistake that the US is making is that we're putting our interests ahead of our values. Whereas, which is makes sense in a finite war, but in the new
Mhm.
infinite war model, it's all about your best strategy is to put your values first and then your interests. So one example is if Americans shoot down an enemy combatant and he's still alive, we will actually spend American dollars and use American doctors to bring that enemy back to health. We'll give him our access to our hospitals and whatever. And that's obviously not in our interest, but it's part of our value system. We don't believe in just killing people once they're injured. That's not
Yeah.
part of what it means to be an American.
Mhm.
And that's part of why America is so appealing to so many people around the world because they
Yeah.
view America as, or they have viewed America as the good guys that are always going to stand up for these certain ideals. And that's your best strategy in the new paradigm of infinite war. But what
Mhm.
we've been doing recently is we've just been focusing on what are the American interests, and we don't really care about our values. Like recently with America pulling our troops out of Syria because we don't want to spend money in these like long wars. That's us putting our interests ahead of our values, which is not abandoning our allies who have fought hard for the same ideals that
Yeah.
we care about, the Kurds. And
Mhm.
you see this playing out all over the world where America is stopping to do what it had previously done that was in line with its values because it has this new sense of, oh, here, well, that's not what's most important for our short-term interests. Like, why are we paying all this money? Why are we the watchdogs of the world?
Yeah.
But like it or not, the whole world depends on American hegemony and military protection as much
Yeah.
as the dollar, as much as the English language. It's very important.
Yeah. I mean, it's sometimes a little, Americans can view ourselves as a little bit fucked up because of, there's a lot of bad stuff going on. But at the same time, historically we have been the good guys. We have been able to step in and stamp out, uh, insurgencies in the Middle East, which really don't affect us. Like it's not affecting us nearly as much as it's affecting our allies that
Right.
exist. Obviously 9/11, that obviously affected us. But there are situations where we just protect the world, and that's a good situation to be in. I feel safe as an American,
Hmm.
which is sometimes counterintuitive because we've talked about the future of guns. We have our own issues, but
Yeah.
it's good to be. I don't feel threatened by other countries. Well, I'll say that
Right.
because of the power. And this. What do you think? Do you
Yeah.
think it's good? Like, do you
Yeah,
think it?
well, there's this fantastic historical event that I love to think about, which Dan Carlin talks about in Hardcore History, which is that we developed the atomic bomb before any other nations. So we did that to end World War II, but there was a time period of several months where America realized that we could have total dominance over the world by preventing anyone else from getting nuclear weapons. Meaning, we could have nuked Moscow and pretty much preempted the Cold War and nuked anyone else before they got nuclear weapons and essentially imposed an authoritarian rule over the world for our own, safety, or that's how we would have justified it. But it wasn't part of our value system. So we actually let other countries keep doing their thing, and they did, develop nukes, and then, we eventually signed nuclear disarmament treaties to try to make things a little calmer on the world stage. But it's worth noting that we had the opportunity to totally put our boot to the face of the world, and we chose not to. And
Yeah,
it's not we can't take it for granted that every country that's a world power would act that way. And my
yeah,
biggest fear is that part of that view of America as being benevolent is disintegrating, and that's what's
overseas too.
yeah.
Yeah,
Because
and within.
it all comes down to, are we a good alternative to China? And if it's just that, well, the US is kind of fucked up anyways, they're corrupt, they really just care about themselves, they do American isolationism, then it's like, well, we are getting this fantastic offer from China where they say they'll protect us, they'll invest this money in our infrastructure, it becomes something that's a real choice. But if America continues to uphold its real values of freedom of speech, freedom of press, just the individual free will of people, then it's not like China versus the US, it's the free world versus the authoritarian world, which includes the people of China who want not to live under an authoritarian regime. It's no longer countries battling countries, it's ideals that are intrinsically valuable to human beings versus ideals that are intrinsically not, or that impose limits on your own freedom. And that's a battle that I'm willing to say that we would win, an ideological
Yeah,
battle. Even if the
yeah,
technology is better, you could imagine, the top AI researchers in China at the last minute saying, like, you know what, I don't know if we want Beijing to have this power. Maybe let's, reach out to the US, similar to how, Einstein and
yeah.
Oppenheimer,
Hmm.
went to the US side during World War II, even though they were German, because they
Right.
realized that they wanted to be on the side of freedom.
Yeah.
But we're losing that now, and it's scary. And all of these different aspects, I think, are all kind of stem from that instability.
Hmm. So was that your worst case? Is that one of your worst cases?
Well, let's get into it. Let's get into the worst case.
Worst case scenario.
So my worst case scenario is that we fall into Thucydides' trap. And
Okay.
Thucydides' trap is something that Thucydides remarked on during the rise of Athens when Sparta had previously been the main power in that region. And the quote from Thucydides is that it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this inspired in Sparta that made war inevitable. And so he's speaking to this dynamic where when there's a rising power, the ruling power gets scared, and this inevitably leads to war. So my worst case scenario is that does happen. And I think it will be exacerbated by America filtering through its interests first which is kind of what the whole America first means, and then its values second, or not at all. And then it would be very easy to see how that could take place. So in my worst case, there is some third party event happens, like the invading of Taiwan or something like that, or they shoot down a satellite, or any of the number of things we've talked about, and it results in a true World War III that results in essentially wiping out civilization. I think it's unrealistic to say that everyone would die, but you could imagine us like taking a big step back from the progress we've had thus far.
Mm-hmm.
Like if all the satellites got wiped out, for instance, that alone would be a huge step back. Like you don't have GPS. Like there's a lot of things that would be ruined by that.
Yeah.
Bank accounts wiped out, that kind of thing. In my second worst case, like not quite as bad as civilization being wiped out, but still a worst case, would be that China essentially becomes the new dominant power, and we find ourselves living in a world that has to adhere to the same censorship policies that are in place in mainland China today. So you could imagine if, let's say, there was some World War III type of event, but America kind of knows it's not going to win, and the wealthy people just want to sort of do what's best for themselves, and then we kind of just are like, okay, yeah, China kind of rules things now. Maybe we get some little concessions that allow us to do things somewhat in our own way, but by and large, China is kind of like the new ruling power of the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
That would still be really bad, just because there would be far less freedoms. People wouldn't be able to speak their mind. That would be another worst case in my mind.
Yeah.
And I mean, like I said, I think I pretty much said what I wanted to as far as what America needs to do to prevent that. So that's my worst case. I'm interested to hear yours.
Yeah, I think you covered on a couple that I was thinking. One that I sort of mentioned early on is my version of humanity being wiped out, and that's legitimately, a species-ending event, which is nuclear bombs, nuclear warfare. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that is remotely likely until an organization like ISIS gets a hold of nukes, and a lot of them. So that's like the ultimate worst case, is literally civilization ending. Humanity needs to start over from scratch, or evolution needs to start over from scratch, essentially. So that's one worst case. I think another worst case is if war is completely driven by AI, and there's no humanity involved except for the humans dying. Right. So I think if you've ever heard Jocko Willink's podcast, so he's a retired Navy SEAL, he always talks about how war brings out the worst of humanity and the best of humanity. And I think that if it was only AI driven, there would not be any of the best of humanity that gets out during war. It's only the worst. Right. It's only the killing. It's only like the cold-bloodedness of warfare. And I think that's about as bad as it can be in terms of how wars are fought. So, those are the two that are different from what you've said. You touched on a lot of other good things, though. So I'll stick with those for my worst case.
Yeah, that's good.
What do you think for the best case, then?
Best case scenario.
So my best case scenario is that we avoid Thucydides' trap, and that would occur by doing what I've said, where we really stick to our values and we become a legitimate alternative to the model of authoritarian rule that China's been putting forth. Mm-hmm. However, I still think there would be some sort of event that would have to happen to spark us to come together to, as you say, bring out the best in humanity. Mm-hmm. So let's say there was some event, I'm not going to say what it is, but if there was some event that was bad for both the US and China, and it was bad enough that it brought us both to the table, where we then put together a new, stronger form of the United Nations, like the League of Nations, like the Geneva Convention, something along those lines, where we come to an agreement on, okay, here's how the world is going to be ruled so that it makes sense for all of our conflicting values. And, here's where the line is as far as information war, like you can't hack into elections, like this and that. Here's what it is for, cyber war, like you can't shut off, power grids for that will kill civilians and hospitals. Here's what the rules are for nuclear. Like if we just have a new agreement that sort of draws out humanitarian lines in the sand, and then we stick to that, and it's truly signed off on both sides, and we can go to the next stage, which is a sort of form of global governance, which we've talked about a lot, which is necessary for solving a lot of the global problems like AI, like climate change, like asteroids coming to Earth, or what, all of these big potential events. That is the best case scenario. But it to me, it seems unlikely unless there's some triggering event. Like I couldn't imagine us just coming to the table with the way things are now, because there's just game theory doesn't. It just seems like the temptation to defect from such a treaty would be too great.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good best case. Like you said, maybe a little unlikely, but I hope it happens.
Yeah.
Besides, the very catastrophically bad thing that brought us together in the first place.
Right.
Because like the ideal, like true best case is like there's no more war. There's no
Right.
there's no necessity for war. But obviously that doesn't bring out an interesting conversation.
Well, one other best case I'll say, which is also unlikely, is let's say there was a big change of heart in China. Like let's say the Hong Kong protests continue to ensue, and they actually, spread to the mainland, and then you have a new leader in China that really does care about freedom and sort of makes the laws in mainland China similar to what people in Hong Kong are asking for. Then it could, we could be able to see a China rise above the US without any sort of conflict, and with it being, because we would have shared values. And like it would be fine if China rose above the US if we had shared values. The whole issue at hand is that we have very different ideas of how the way the world should run.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that's also a good one. So the one best case that I'll add here is very similar to what you were talking about, and it's essentially where the US or some country with values of the idyllic US prevails in terms of its superpower. It would almost have the same effect as the Avengers being a thing, right? Where like they fight evil at all costs, and they'll destroy evil at all costs, and like they're there for the little man, the little guy, and will always fight for the good of the people. That kind of
super soldiers like Master Chief and Halo.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, but you could have a country that's like that, and the U.S. historically had been that country.
Right.
I just think in the best case, we just have to advance way more quickly than we currently are. And there is the talk of there's a lot of innovation going on in defense because there's so much spending in defense. We're still probably, but at the same time, you also made the point that China is taking a lot of, they're potentially stealing a lot of the IP.
We can no longer outspend China because their economy is bigger. So that worked last century. It's not going to work this century.
Yeah, so that we'll see. I mean, again, that best case is not the most likely case by any means, but it would be good if there was some sort of superpower that was so much more dominant than anything else that it could just wipe out evil essentially always. That would
that could also happen just if we're the first, if the first benevolent general purpose AI is developed in the US, that could, it's on its own, fill that role.
Yeah, I mean, if general AI is solved, that would basically mean that no war is necessary because whoever created that AI would win no matter what.
Hmm.
I mean, if you think of if it really was a general intelligence that could improve
Right,
upon
right,
itself and, innovate at the speed of like 10,000 human years per minute.
right, exactly. Yeah,
So, so yeah, that would be, and that might be more likely,
yeah. Hmm.
that might be the way that we can get to that level, or quantum computing, for example. Then there's no security vulnerability, or we can hack anybody
Yeah,
because of the um, key. Anyways, we talked about how there's like quantum encryption as well as decryption, so
right,
that probably
right.
wouldn't be the fix that solves everything. But anyways, I'm curious to know, to round it out, what your likely scenario is.
Most likely scenario.
My most likely scenario is that China does achieve most of its milestones that it's set forth. So it does become the most dominant in the main sectors of technology. Um, like I said, the Chinese economy is greater than the U.S. economy. So our strategy of outspending them and just having many bases around the world with many different proxy battles, it's no longer going to work like it used to because we've really spread ourselves thin. Whereas China's
Hmm.
strategy has been more about like focusing on its own regional security rather than doing stuff in like very disparate places. Although it
Yep.
has been building its own, infrastructure and, their
Hmm.
great road that's sort of based on the Silk Road.
Yep.
So yeah, I think that in my most likely scenario, the proxy battles do continue, and there is some massive event that occurs in our lifetime. And the only reason I have this as most likely is that when you just look throughout history, there has never been a century where great powers haven't fought against each other. So
Really?
if that
I
happens
actually didn't know that.
in the 20, at least in recorded history, maybe in
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
caveman times or whatever, but if the 21st century does not see a great war between the great powers, it will be the first century ever for that to have happened. So it's hard to say that it's more likely that there isn't a conflict than there is.
Hmm.
So the real question is what happens when such an event does take place? How does the world respond?
Hmm.
And that's something that I don't want to say much about because it's really up to you, the listener, and
Yeah.
just people in general. And that's why I always come back to the values piece of it because even when we talk about these countries, and it can feel very abstract, and you villainize this country, and this country's good, and that country's, somewhere in the middle. They're all just people making these decisions, at least right now. There is the whole other can of worms of AI making decisions on its own and autonomous weapons, and that's also something we should keep an eye on. But at least right now, the most important inputs are real, live human beings who have friends and family and hopes and dreams and worries and frustrations. And if we can stick to our values as Americans in the free world, then I think we are in a far better position no matter how capable an authoritarian regime is, simply because we have the more favorable ideals.
Hmm. Yeah, that honestly, that's it. That's exactly what my likely was. I do think China's going to dominate, but I do think that just the basic nature of the way that freedom, like the effect that freedom has on people, people will fight for that to the
Hmm.
death. Like, if you think that the US will just willy-nilly or just willingly fall into an authoritarian regime or follow the rules that China tries to lay out, I think they've got another
Yeah.
thing coming. Like, it will be a fight to the death if that really happens. And I think that's where the game theory thing will come into play too. Like, does China really want to take that risk? I think the US would rather risk mutually assured destruction than fall into that. At least like the way that the American patriot, the ideal American patriot is like, I would rather die than, fall into your...
Give me death or give me freedom.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that might be a good place to wrap it up.
Awesome. Well, thank you to our listeners. This has been The Future of War. And we'll see you next time.
The past, the present, and the future.
Our computer is picking up a strange signal.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
What's the world coming to?
The past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby. The past, the present, and the future.
Let's have this stimulated consciousness.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
Behind this strange signal is an alien
The
intelligence.
past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby.
It's possible.
Hey futurists, if you've made it this far, you might be wondering who created the Hence the Future theme song. It was created by the Walden Brothers, and you can find them on Spotify. The Walden Brothers also produced the sound bites for the worst case, the best case, and the most likely future scenarios. At Hence the Future, we're always looking for ways to improve the quality of our episodes and our predictions. To that end, we're building a team of researchers to curate the most authoritative and highly vetted sources as the foundation for every episode. If you'd like to support these efforts, you can donate a small monthly amount at anchor.fm/hencethefuture. And if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate your support.